what I'm trying to say in that article or that chapter is that the relationship between private and public, or government and church, or government and the private sector under its many forms, secular, citizens organization, or business, is always to some extent an understanding. So you can't understand one without the other. So the border changes. So it's a question of extent, and very often of mutual agreement, not of separate evolutions. And I try to show that dynamic all the time. So in times, say, of conservative government under Mulroney and Harper, the public sector, in a way, diminished itself to give more autonomy and resources to the private philanthropy. You saw that in Canadian humanitarian aid, where the Canadian International Development Agency ended up closing itself. And that was accompanied by a lot of lobby and rise in influence within the conservative government or of church-based organization. So they got much more money than under previous liberal government, and they led the agenda of how do you distribute Canadian money abroad. So very often Canadian funds would be managed and channeled by faith-based organization in countries that Canada was aiding. And also the Canadian government in general promoted and supported these faith-based organizations. The other question, which is with us all the time these days, is the question of residential schools. So if you consider the churches as philanthropic organization, and you look at residential schools, church-led residential schools, which was most of them, as philanthropic institutions or nonprofit institutions, then the agreement that the state had with these churches is paramount and tends to be forgotten, especially at times when the worst aspects of Catholic and Protestant residential schools is highlighted. It looks like they were doing that all by themselves, but they were condoned, supported, encouraged, and fully part of a state system. And it was mutually beneficial. The church did it for its own institutional autonomous reasons, but could never have done that without the state. And the state, in a way, it was convenient for them to outsource these things to institutions that were used since Europe, since pre-colonial times in Europe, to educate and convert and cure, right? So, and, hold them mentally sick and, organize social work around jails. And so the state was, like for education, only too ready to give that stuff to the church. So the state was supposed to inspect and keep standards, which they did more or less. And sometimes the public responsibility for these philanthropic institutional abuses is not acknowledged enough. If I may say, there's a lot of filling gaps as well. Like, so you can also see it's not all one law. And I say that a bit in my chapter, but not much. So very often, like Save the Children International and the Canadian Save the Children Fund, for instance, in the early 1900s, they deliberately say, here is a need which is not fulfilled. And until the state takes over, we'll show that need and fill it. But there's always the ambition that some of that will be eventually taken on by the state, right? So a lot of Canadian philanthropy abroad through Save the Children was like, fireman's job after World War I in Eastern European countries or in Greece, distributing food, organizing orphanages, teaching children in refugee camps until the state would be stabilized, or until new states were born in the former Ottoman Empire and in the former Russian Empire. So they they really have this self-conscious idea that they're patching up stuff until states are intervening. So that's a big part of philanthropy, but it's not the only one. They don't think that one day they will vanish. They always think that there is a place for citizens, voluntary work and voluntary funding that does not participate, is not part of the same logic as the state, where you have compulsory taxation and universal rights for all. These are different logics and different roles. And the other part where philanthropy is experimenting and opening the way is the more international solidarity or domestic solidarity front of philanthropy, where philanthropy and social movements overlap. And so organizations that I study the history of like Oxfam did a lot of that and still do a lot of that, where they campaign to attract the attention to problems that they hope eventually will be taken on by society and become more of a public responsibility.